Both sides of the political spectrum admire Robert Woodson. He is the only person to have received both the MacArthur Foundation's Genius Fellowship and the Bradley Foundation Prize, very prestigious liberal and conservative awards. This is a unique achievement and ought to lead us to ask why. Bob Woodson is the founder and president of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, which he started in 1981. He has dedicated his life to helping low-income people address the problems of their communities. The center's motto is transforming lives, schools, and troubled neighborhoods from the inside out, and this exemplifies Woodson's philosophy. Woodson believes that the foundation of any healthy relationship is reciprocity, and he strives to ennoble those that he works with. As a result, the center has provided training and assistance for over 2,600 leaders of community-based groups in 39 different states. Woodson is very good friends with Paul Ryan, as John Andrews mentioned yesterday. They travel around the country together looking at nonprofits and businesses that have successful models of helping the poor. A few years ago, the Washington Week group from CCU had the privilege of spending an entire day with Bob. They visited the places that he helps to run through the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, helping addicts get clean and then find work, giving them a sense of responsibility. Woodson is guided by a principle from the story of Joseph, where Pharaoh takes advice from an uneducated Hebrew prisoner and slave and then empowers him to lead. Woodson goes into low-income neighborhoods and he looks for the Josephs there. He desires to let those people teach others, putting resources at their disposal and empowering them to serve their communities. It's fair to say that he has been successful in this mission, and it's truly a pleasure to have him with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Woodson.
Thank you. I think I'm going to take that young man back with me. I want to, first of all, just say hello and thank you to the leader of CCU and my friend, Bill Armstrong. I must confess, I'm a Bill Armstrong junkie. I met him through our friend Jack Kemp many, many years ago when he was in the U.S. Senate, and we were seeking support for 7 amendments to the U.S. Housing Act that would give residents of low-income public housing the right not only to manage but to own their own properties and take charge of their lives. And I came to Bill Armstrong, and Bill agreed to sponsor this legislation. It had no political advantage at all for him. And then he joined with Alan Dixon, liberal senator from Illinois, to co-sponsor, and we won 93-0 in the Senate. And then Jack Kemp joined with Fauntleroy in the House, and we passed with 1 vote against, and Ronald Reagan signed those laws into effect, flanked by myself and 6 residents of public housing. So Bill Armstrong continues to be morally consistent man of principle who at a board meeting at the trustees said, I am a Christian before I am a conservative. I am a Christian before I am a Republican. And so I subscribe to that, and I would like to speak to you as a Christian first and foremost, and only secondarily am I a Republican, only secondarily am I a conservative. Because America is, as the Bible, Ezekiel says, Israel was not in the state that it was in because it had a failed economy. Israel was in the state that it was in because it strayed from God's teachings and failed to continue to pursue the path of righteousness. And America is in a moral drift right now. To the extent that we are consistent with those principles, God will continue to bless us. And I know that God was at the blessings of when this nation was founded by virtue of 3 miracles that are in history that demonstrates this. When George Washington in the Battle of Monongahela, the French and Indian War, in July 9th, 1755, the British were on the way to Duquesne when they were attacked. and you know the story that George Washington, all the other officers were failed around him, were fell with bullets, but only he survived. And he told his brother, by all powerful dispensations of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectations. For I've had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot from under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions all around me. Well, an old Indian chief, 15 years later, heard that George Washington was in the area, and he met with him and spoke through an interpreter. And he said that he had all of his best braves, the sharpshooters, and he said, and we aimed at certain that he would die. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas in vain, the power of the mighty had shielded you. And that, listen, the Great Spirit protected that man, pointing to Washington. I came to pay homage to the man who in particular favor of heaven, who can never die in battle. The second miracle was August the 27th, 1776, when General Howe trapped General Washington and 8,000 troops on the Brooklyn Heights, Long Island, intending to advance the next morning. And this was in a desperate move, but suddenly a fog came up that night that lasted well into the morning, so thick that one could not see one's hands in front of the face. And that fog stayed there long enough for George Washington's troops to escape across the East River. Meteorologists said they cannot think of any time when such a phenomenon would occur. The last miracle occurred in 1812 when the British were at the Battle of Bladensburg, ready to take the capital, and a hurricane swept through the city and drove them back. I believe that this is evidence, historical evidence of God's direct intervention in the restoration of this nation and protection of this nation. And to the extent that we are willing to adhere to and support and continue these practices, it will be the extent to which America will continue to prosper and to continue to lead. Samuel Adams wrote, and I think this provides a good introduction to my remarks, that a general dissolution of principles and manners will more surely overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of a common enemy. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued, but when they lose their virtue, they will be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. For if virtue and knowledge are diffused among the people, they will never be enslaved, and this will be their great security. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenge that we face in America is not strengthening our military, nor is it the strength of our economy, nor is it our political system. Our founders understood that all of these three are but empty vessels into which we pour our values as a nation. And if those values are going to be continued, they have to be in the hearts and minds and in the souls and in the actions of its people. And what does this spirit look like? How can you tell when it's present? Well, see, I use simple pedestrian examples to illustrate very profound things. And I remember some years ago that when Florida State played University of Florida, and the score at halftime was 50-0. And this was playing at home, and all the fans were booing and just throwing things at the team when they went into the locker room. But they came out of the locker room and won the game 62-53. The same team, the same coaches, different spirit. When God is in you, you're able to do things that everyone said are impossible. And so America is like that. And we see evidence, there's a thirst for these virtues that Samuel Adams talked about, and we see it expressed in very simple ways. Remember when this homeless man in Boston, who was 46 years old, he found a backpack with $43,000 in cash and traveler's checks. And he turned it in. And somebody took his name and put it on Facebook to raise money for him. $93,000 in 2 days was raised to support this man. A man in Oakland, homeless man, a woman came and emptied her change purse into his basket. But she had in there, without realizing, her $15,000 wedding ring. She came back to him, and she walked up and he said, "Are you looking for this?" Someone posted his name on Facebook. They raised $120,000 for him. An 18-year-old young man who was a manager at Dairy Queen saw this blind man come up to the counter to buy some ice cream. He dropped $20 out of his pocket. And a lady behind him picked it up and put it in her purse. And he said, "Would you return the money?" And she said no. Now, he refused to serve her, but he also took $20 out of his own pocket and gave it to the man and said, "You lost this." Someone observed this and posted this on Facebook. They raised $600,000 in 2 weeks for this young man. The point is that Americans are thirsty to support virtue. When Hurricane Sandy struck the shores of New Jersey, yes, the government helped as first responders, but 60% of the people said it was the voluntary effort, the spontaneous outpouring of people who came from all over the country with water, with food, with refrigerators, walking up 3 flights of steps to help a mom with 3 children. They didn't ask, first of all, were those 2 children of a relationship where you were married? They didn't ask whether it was a black child or a white child, nor whether or not the person had a criminal record. The spirit of America is to respond in response to a crisis. Now, if we can respond with virtue in the time of a crisis, how do we begin to institutionalize this concern, this passion that we have to help one another? How do we take what happens spontaneously like this and incorporate it into a strategy to remoralize and create a moral reawakening in America? But we cannot do it as long as we are divided as we are at the present time. The people that I represent around the country, low-income, grassroots people living in drug-infested, crime-ridden, toxic neighborhoods. I tell people 80% of my closest friends are ex-something. But, so the question is, how do we begin to connect this world, these 2 worlds? The only we can do it, we've got to take certain challenges off the table, such as race. We've got to find a way around it. And the leaders for this, and I'd like to, there is the passion, there is the commitment to the American ideal. The question, what is the way? So I would like to talk with you this morning, describe what I think would be a proper way to bring about a systematic responding and generation of virtue so that we can come together and begin to ignite a moral brush fire in America that burns from the bottom up and the inside out. Because this is essential if we are to meet the challenges that are coming from the East, the Middle East. We have to be united the way we were against fascism. In the Second World War, even though we were divided racially, we had segregation. When fascism was our common enemy, black, white, everybody came together to fight against. And in the black community, we used to say victory abroad and victory at home. Victory against fascism in Europe and victory against racism. But we fought alongside, not a single black that fought In the Second World War, not a single black was ever tried for treason. Not a single one, even with the disparities and injustice at the time, because we knew that God had blessed this nation, and our best chance of achieving the full and complete life was to support the founding principles, even those that penned them many times did not even become worthy of them. That's why I know they're from God, because why would someone put in place a set of principles that hold their own action suspect if it wasn't from God? And so the question is, what is the way? And sometimes we have to look in strange places. That's why the theme of my talk is, how do we begin to call upon the invisible heroes that, and began to look beyond the established plan. I was watching PBS the other day, and it was a special on the invasion of Normandy. And we had our grand plan, that the Air Force would fly in, and it said that we dropped 1,200 tons of bombs to soften up the beach. Not one German was killed. Because of the weather, the planes dropped it. The firing from the ships that were supposed to soften the beaches fell on bunkers that were impenetrable, and the rockets fell short. And so it was a slaughter on the beach. And we were in danger of losing this advantage. Omar Bradley was reduced to an observer. But it was one man by the name of Terrence Brady, who was a 21-year-old sergeant. All the officers around him were killed. And this young sergeant knew that they had to get off the beach. So he took this gadget they have, it's a 20-foot, and he blew a hole in the barbed wire and led a small band of soldiers through it. All the other enlisted men followed, and as a result, they outflanked it. And so the victory was ours. By a single 21-year-old sergeant, an invisible hero that no one ever knows about. So sometimes our grand plans that we have for changing things, we got to look to unusual sources for help and support. The Bible also instructs us as what we should do and how we can bring the worlds together. And there are two stories I like to tell. One is 2 Kings in the story of Naaman. Naaman, as you know, was the general to the king of Syria, but he had leprosy. And a 13-year-old servant girl, Hebrew servant in the house of Naaman's, to his wife, said to her, "Tell the master to go to Israel and present himself to the prophet, and he will be healed." So Naaman did what most powerful, influential people, he gathered up gold, horses, clothes, and he went to the king of Israel, thinking that I'm a powerful man, I must go to another powerful man, government going to government. And of course, the king thought this was a pretext of starting war, so he ripped his clothes and said, "I can't cure you." The servant of the king sent him to the house of Elisha. When he arrived at Elisha's house, Elisha refused to see him and instead sent his servant out. Naaman was angry and told him to wash 7 times in the river Jordan. Naaman said, "The rivers in Syria are cleaner than this. Why would I want to do that?" And he started to storm away, angry that I'm a powerful man, and he's going to send a servant out to see me. But the servants of Naaman advised him to listen and heed the word of the prophets, and he did, and he washed himself 7 times in the river Jordan. He was healed. From that day forward, Naaman said, "I will worship the God of Israel," which meant that thousands and thousands of lives were saved, not by the grand plans of powerful people, but by the invisible actions of servants. And I'm sure this 13-year-old girl could have said, I'm sure she was captive and maybe her parents were killed. But she still put her commitment to this master. So the real story here is that sometimes those invisible heroes that we need to listen not to always the wealthy and powerful for new directions, but we must condition ourselves to look for solutions in unusual places among unusual people. And which leads me to the story of Joseph. As you know, Joseph was from a dysfunctional Hebrew family. But he was arrogant, and he told his brothers that he saw them bow down before him. That's not the way to endear yourself to your siblings. And you know the story. He was sold into slavery. He faked his death, sold into slavery. But to the Ishmaelites, he served in the house of Potiphar. But even in his period of oppression, he became the best servant in the house of Potiphar. And he was a very handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife lusted for him and tried to have sex. He refused because he had a horizontal integrity and lateral integrity. He said it would be a violation of my commitment to my master, but more important, a sin against my God. So she sent all the servants out, came on to him, grabbed his robe. He was placed in prison where he languished for years. But Joseph became the best prisoner. He was still faithful to his God, even though he had suffered injustice. If he had succumbed to becoming a victim and sought retribution against the Egyptians and reparations for his time, we would not know about him. But he was faithful. And then two of Pharaoh's servants, he helped them, and they pledged to help him, and they refused. And then one day, Pharaoh had a dream that none of his experts, his PhDs, his MBAs, could solve. And the servant remembered Joseph, and they brought him before him. And you know the story. He said there'll be 7 years of famine, served by 7 years of plenty, save up 20%. First time we ever heard of flat tax. But this is, and so what happened, they say that, and Egypt prospered, and he was appointed overseer, second only to Pharaoh in power. This is a very important message for us as conservatives, because what this illustrates to me is that, first of all, powerful, influential people have to be humble enough to dream bad dreams in good times. Not to be impressed with the power and influence that you have, but to be able to look beyond the horizon and see that there's something that's menacing, like America has. Something is menacing, and therefore we've got, if you want to do something you haven't done, you got to go someplace you haven't been, you got to be able to do something you haven't done. But what Pharaoh did is what we must think about doing. How do we look across race, across ethnicity, across social condition? Pharaoh chose an uneducated 31-year-old Hebrew. And when he was brought before Pharaoh and he said, bow down to the God Pharaoh, he refused. So Pharaoh, first of all, knew he had integrity. And so, but he also knew that it was not a religious relationship, because Joseph had a reputation of being a good steward. So they had a business agreement. And together, they said, Egypt fed the world. The lessons for us is that we must also reach across racial and ethnic lines and do the unusual, and not to be impressed with someone's professional credentials, but look at what influence that they have. And I look at it, when I go into low-income neighborhoods, I look for two types of Josephs. There are Josephs like Joseph in the Bible that never rode on a stolen bike. They are in poverty, but not of poverty. They're raising children that are not dropping out of school. They're not in jail. They're not in drugs. But we don't look for them. And then there are the other types of Josephs that became prostitutes, that became gangbangers, that became drug addicts. And through God's grace, their hearts have been transformed and their lives have been redeemed. And therefore, they are witnesses to others that redemption is possible, that your circumstance doesn't have to dictate your future. And just because you started life under difficult circumstances, that God can use you anyway. So these are the types of Josephs that we go into low-income neighborhoods and we look for examples of moral excellence among those two types of Josephs. The challenge that we face is finding the pharaohs today that have enough personal security to recognize that they have needs that all of their current experts cannot satisfy, and that we must reach across racial and ethnic lines and begin to embrace and endorse people. Because I can take you into these communities. I had Paul Ryan. I said to Paul, come to Indianapolis, Indiana, and go into this church that's in the highest crime area in the city, where a black young pastor has, over the past 8 years, 120 men come for 20 straight days at 5:30 in the morning to 7, no breakfast, to learn how Christ can transform their lives. And he has brought about a miraculous change. 80% of these men that come through his ministry began to rejoin their families, become better husbands, faithful to their wives, and he forms islands of excellence in there. What he and others like him need, though, is a connections to the pharaohs in that city. We have a man named Kurt Moore, who spent 13 years in federal prison, came to Christ while in prison. And as I tell these young people, if you find Christ in prison and leave him at the door, he'll be there when you come back. But Kurt is one of these rare men who found Christ in prison, took Christ with him when he out, and continues. And Kurt stood up in one of the boot camp sessions and said, I need to work. And so another man had a garage and said, come and wash cars for me. After 4 months of washing cars, this man says, well, why don't you start your own business? He let him use a van, helped him buy some equipment. Kurt began to wash cars in people's driveway. Next thing you know, 3 years later, he has 15 employees. He also has contracts with 23 dealers in the city. But because he's in jail, he has no credit. What I did when Paul Ryan came there is connected him with 5 local pharaohs that are joining in partnership with him, helping him with access to capital, but also helping him to learn how to run a business. So what we can do as conservatives is not just bring money to the table, but we ought to act like a venture capitalist. And so every place that Paul has gone around the country where we find these local cadre of Josephs, we're looking for opportunities to begin to plant the seeds of enterprise in these cities so we can begin to unite the pharaohs and the Josephs. So when people say, what do conservatives stand for? Where are there examples of conservatism in action? We can point to these centers of economic and moral revitalization as an example of what God can do. And so there are other examples like that. So the best way, when Jesus was asked, are you the one, the servants of Jesus, the John the Baptist asked, are you the one or shall we seek another? Jesus did not answer with his resume. He didn't say, wasn't I born in Bethlehem? Didn't the Spirit of the Lord come to you? No, Jesus healed in their presence and said, go tell your master what you saw. If we want people to embrace conservative principles, we have to do what Jesus did. Not to confront situations of despair with superior arguments, or to have another conference or publish another study. We must reach out into these areas of despair and look for social entrepreneurs, these Josephs, who God's heart has turned around, and join in common community. Because you see, the left will not do it, because people, 80%, 70% of the money spent on poor people goes not to them, it goes to those who serve poor people. So people on the left ask not which problems are solvable, but which ones are fundable. So we as a nation in the past 50 years have created a commodity out of poor people. So the poor understand that their only value to the left is their problems and their dependency. So that those of us on the right have strategic interests that are compatible with the poor. Therefore, that's the reason that we can join in common community. Because if you have a business, you need people who are sober, courteous, can show up on time, and serve people. Poor people need places to work. So, to conclude, if the conservative movement is to be a viable movement, it has to demonstrate by its actions that it can address the needs of the least of God's children through our actions. The first thing we've got to do is, and I'm saying to my fellow conservative scholars, cease all your failure studies. You can learn nothing by studying failure except how to create it. Look at grassroots people as social entrepreneurs. Look for what is the common ground that you have. We know that social entrepreneurs, the principles that operate in our market economy must operate in our social economy. In our market economy, most of the entrepreneurs tend to be C students. A students come back to CCU and teach, C students endow. Because what grassroots Joseph have in common with commercial entrepreneurs is that they're able to act in the presence of their own doubts and uncertainties. See, very smart people have to have all the answers before they act, and when they act, the opportunity's gone. And so there is common ground for us as conservatives to establish some long-lasting relationships. But we must stop just presenting gloom and doom to the public. We are becoming a right-wing grievance industry. We must stop the grievance. When we have conferences, we do not allow anyone to put a problem on the table unless they have a solution. What we must emphasize is resurrection and not crucifixion. Even Christ did not hang around the cross. And we must understand that if our problems was economic, God would have sent an economist. If it was education, he would have sent an educator. If it was history, they would have sent a historian. But because our problem of sin, he sent a Savior. And so it is important for us to understand this, and important for us to join in common community with those that are in these communities. And that's why what I'm suggesting, that there must be investment. We've got to do more with low-income people, and they come express our compassion and support for what they do. We must invest. We spent $1 billion losing an election. Most of it going to attack ads against the opposition. If a fraction of that were invested in the restoration of communities, then you will see a different result. Like Dick Riordan in the 90s was a Republican who ran for the mayor, but 2 years before Dick Riordan ran for the mayor of Los Angeles, he helped build a community center in the middle of a lowest income East LA community called the Riordan Center. And then he was supported. He didn't do it for political purposes, but if you plant charitably, you can harvest politically. But you cannot plant and harvest in the same year. So what I'm suggesting is that if we begin, and this is what I'm saying to Paul and those who support Paul and conservatives, it's fine to come, but you should come prepared to invest. Not just your money, but also your time and your experience and your expertise. So if we can't just criticize poor people for not being a part of our economy, we must provide them with the means to help themselves. And when they do, because Paul Ryan has visited more low-income black communities than any member of the Black Caucus. Because they don't need to visit. The left doesn't have to do anything. And so, therefore, there's an opportunity for us to bring together these worlds of ours. And I just hope and pray that you will continue to provide this kind of support and give serious consideration to what we are trying to do at CCU, Bill, to try to build this alliance. America, if it's to be restored, is going to have to come from the bottom up, the inside out. And if we are to receive God's blessing, we must deserve it. God bless you and thank you.